The lecture we're going to go over today is Losing Faith, Vietnam and Watergate, how the American people lose confidence in the federal government in 1964 and 1980. What we have to understand is the American people always trusted their government, that their government would tell them the truth, the government would take care of their needs and protect their civil rights. And what we're going to start seeing in this lecture, and this is really a lot of the hallmark of the 1960s and also the part of the 1970s, is the American people begin to lose faith in their government and to the point where they don't trust their government or the people they elected as their leaders. And we're seeing a lot of these effects that are even continue today. The first thing we're going to focus on is the tragedy of the Vietnam War. After the death of JFK, Lyndon Baines Johnson, also known as LBJ, would inherit the policy of preventing communist supremacy in Indochina. He did not see any reason to save Vietnam, but since the United States was already committed, he saw no way to extricate the advisors. Then on August 7th, 1964, LBJ appeared on TV and informed the American public that the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy had been fired on by North Vietnamese vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. He did not mention that they had been monitoring South Vietnamese attacks on North Vietnamese troops planned by American advisors. He then asked Congress for a resolution authorizing the president to take all necessary steps to repel attacks against the United States forces. He received it, and by March 1965, combat troops began to arrive in Vietnam. LBJ's decision to go into Vietnam was consistent with the foreign policies of all presidents back to Harry Truman. At the time, military intervention was the logical next step for him to take. In a battle of wills, the North Vietnamese won as public support in the United States eroded. Opposition to the war grew as more of the nation's youth are going to be drafted and sent to war in Vietnam. Some college campuses hosted teach-ins in which professors criticized the war and American involvement in it. And many students argued that the nation needed to deal with its own problems, including racism and poverty, before fighting in other parts of the world. General William C. Westmoreland and other military leaders continued to ask for more funding, supplies, and soldiers. Johnson became so focused on the war that his other projects and policies began to lose attention. The decision to escalate. President Johnson dispatches the first American ground troops. Robert McNamara, as Secretary of Defense, supported a buildup of U.S. forces in Vietnam. And between 1965 and 1967, the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam reached 500,000. The commander of U.S. troops in Vietnam was General William Westmoreland. A working class war. Draft policies would favor young men from privileged backgrounds. In the early years of the war, a young man could be automatically deferred from the draft by enrolling in college. As long as he stayed in college, he could not be drafted, which would be a great incentive to make sure you do well in school. Most American soldiers in Vietnam are going to be minorities and lower class whites of the working class. African Americans would make up as much as 20% or even more of Army personnel at the start of the Vietnam War. They also volunteered for infantry and airborne units. Most American women in Vietnam served as military nurses or as volunteers. Roots of opposition. The New Left movement included such activist groups such as Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, and the Free Speech Movement, FSM, and they are going to push for social and political change. SDS and FSM tactics spread to college campuses nationwide. College students began joining together to protest the Vietnam War. Campus protests mount as more college students become eligible for the draft. More young Americans would resist the draft. The American public becomes deeply divided into the opponents and supporters of the war. So once college students become eligible for the draft, Now they're very concerned about getting drafted and going to the war. That deferment is not going to count. The Tet Offensive. U.S. officials had predicted that American armies were near victory. General Giap, commander of the North Vietnamese Army forces, clearly indicated that NVA troops were without sufficient supplies and had been continually defeated time and time again. By 1968, NVA morale was at its lowest point ever. And the plans for Tet in 68 was that their last desperate attempt to achieve a success in an effort to boost the NVA morale. Simultaneously, the cities and towns of South Vietnam were attacked and dubbed the Tet Offensive due to occurring on the Vietnamese New Year. Traditionally, there has always been a ceasefire during the Tet. Early in 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched a surprise attack on January 21st, 1968. Khe Sanh, the Marines' fire base, could shell the Ho Chi Minh Trail from Khe Sanh. The NVA VC attacked the Marines at Khe Sanh, hoping to take it over like Dien Bien Phu, like they did to defeat the French. The aftermath of Tet. The Tet Offensive undermined the American public pride in the Vietnam War. The military attacks failed, but television coverage showed the brutality of the war, lowering civilian morale. The request for 200,000 more troops led to a revaluation that advised Johnson to disengage. According to Colonel Buten in his interview with the Wall Street Journal in 1998, Colonel Buten was on General Giap's staff, and then he would leave and flee Vietnam when he became disillusioned after the communists had taken over. He said that Giap had been frustrated as Khe Sanh and also the defeat in South Vietnamese cities. When it was over, General Giap and the NVA viewed the Tet 68 offensive as a failure, and they were on their knees and had prepared to possibly negotiate a surrender. At that time, there were fewer than 10,000 U.S. casualties. The Vietnam War looked like it was about to end as the NVA was prepared to accept their defeat. Then they heard Walter Cronkite, former CBS News anchor and correspondent on TV, proclaiming the success of the Tet 68 offensive by the communist NVA. He also said that the Americans should begin to withdraw, that it was over. They were totally and completely amazed at hearing that the U.S. Embassy had been overrun, which in reality the NVA had not gained access to the embassy. Now, there were some VC who had been killed on the grassy lawn, but they hadn't gained any access. Also in 1968, violence in politics. On April 4th, 1968, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis by James Earl Ray. King's death set out the worst wave of race riots in the nation's history. Fires devastated the west side of Chicago and Washington, D.C. Then on June 5th, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy, after winning the California primary, was in the position to receive the Democratic nomination. After the Tet Offensive, Johnson had decided to withdraw for running for president of the United States, and Kennedy was set to face off against Richard Nixon in the general election. But he's going to be assassinated by a 22-year-old Palestinian, Saran due to Kennedy's support of Israel. In the election of 1968, George Wallace was the nominee of the American Party. The Republicans at their convention in Miami chose Richard Nixon. Kennedy's death ensured that Hubert Humphrey would be the Democratic nominee. Robert Kennedy's death altered the dynamics of the race. Although Humphrey appeared the prohibitive favorite for the nomination, thanks to his support from the traditional power blocks of his party, he was an unpopular choice with many of the anti-war elements within the party, who identified him with Johnson's controversial position on the Vietnam War. In Chicago, attracted the anti-war protesters, and Mayor Richard Daley ordered 20,000 police and National Guardsmen to put down the protest. The Democratic Convention Guardsmen to keep the order, but when they could not, anxious reporters broadcast the riots across the nation. It looked to people watching the Democratic National Convention that Democrats had lost all control of what was going on in the country. The results: Richard Nixon would win the presidency with the help of George Wallace, the American Independent Party candidate. Now, Wallace won several southern states, offering an alternative to white Southerners unhappy with the Democratic Party, but not yet prepared to vote Republican. He also drew northern working class votes away from Hubert Humphrey and thus helped Nixon to take several Midwestern states and win the presidential election. Now, one of the things I want to bring to your attention is look at the popular vote at 43.4% to 42.7%, and that it's almost a 500,000 vote difference. Now, of course, the popular vote does not elect the presidency, it's the electoral vote. But here, once again, Richard Nixon is in a very close election, and this, some presidential historians believe, really affected him psychologically. Peace with honor, ending the Vietnam War. When Nixon was inaugurated, the United States had over 530,000 soldiers in Vietnam. He believed that victory was unattainable and planned to gradual withdraw American troops as a sufficient number of South Vietnamese troops were trained to replace them. Nixon and his future Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, sought a gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam. Negotiations between the United States and South Vietnam on one hand, as well as North Vietnamese and Viet Cong negotiators on the other hand, publicly faltered over the variety of issues, including a communist influence and presence in South Vietnam. Privately, however, Kissinger and North Vietnamese leaders held talks without informing South Vietnamese leaders. Nixon and Kissinger also sought to equip and train South Vietnamese military members so that the American troops could gradually withdraw from combat and the nation in a process called Vietnamization. Meanwhile, they would send more bombing missions to North Vietnam to take the pressure off South Vietnam. And from 1969 to 1973, a lottery system for the American draft addressed a number of the inequities of the former system. In 1973, Nixon did away with the draft, and the Army became purely voluntary. But the slow withdrawal of troops had a horrific effect on the military's morale. No one wanted to be the last to leave or to possibly die in Vietnam. The events in the My Lai massacre further eroded American support for the war back home. Marianne Vecchio, a teenage runaway participating in the anti-war demonstration, decries the killing of a Kent State student after the Ohio National Guard fired into the crowd. Now, when the nation learned that the war had been extended to Cambodia, further protests began. One was held at Kent State University and erupted in violence when the Ohio National Guard members that had been sent to the university fired in response to insults and rocks being hurled at them. A number of students were killed or wounded, as you see here. The Pentagon Papers is when Americans begin to start losing a lot of faith in their government. In June of 1971, Daniel Ellsberg in the Defense Department leaked the Pentagon Papers, which were published in the New York Times. This would further erode public confidence in the government's credibility to accurately report on the Vietnam War. What the Pentagon Papers revealed is that the Gulf of Tonkin was a hoax. It never really happened, as it was presented by President Johnson. So Johnson basically lied to the Congress to get support to fight basically an undeclared war and given a blank check to fight it. Now, Nixon was trying to block the Pentagon Papers, and he would lose in the court process. And so this would also have an effect on Nixon. But now the American people are like, you lied to us? All these thousands and tens of thousands of young boys have been killed in a war based on a lie. So this really begins a lot of the eroding of the trust of the government. Watergate. The foreign policy accomplishments of Nixon made him virtually unbeatable in the 1972 presidential election. The Democrats had nominated George McGovern to challenge him, but McGovern was crushed, receiving 17 electoral votes to Nixon's 520. Nixon would win every state of the Union except one. The election was marred only by an odd break in the Democratic National Convention headquarters in Washington, D.C., at the Watergate Hotel. The trail to break into the Watergate Hotel eventually led right to the White House. As the prosecutors grew closer to Nixon, more members of his staff involved in concealing the illegal wiretaps began to cooperate with them. Nixon refused to turn over documents requested by Congress, citing executive privilege. When one informer, John Dean, revealed that the presence of a taping system in the Oval Office, interesting enough, which was started by President Johnson, a year-long battle for the Nixon tapes began. Eventually, Nixon turned the tapes over, and they were found to have 18 minutes erased. Finally, Nixon resigned in August of 1974. So now the American people see a second president blatantly lie to them. He denied to have any knowledge, and honestly, he did not have any direct knowledge when the Watergate happened. But when he found out about it, he begins to cover up and doing dirty tricks. It was also revealed that Nixon also had an enemies list in which he'd used the Internal Revenue Service to sic on reporters and those who were very negative against him. Having resigned his office, Richard M. Nixon would wave farewell to the White House on August 9, 1974. And although he'd been elected again as vice president, Spiro Agnew did not succeed Nixon. He had been forced to resign when it came to the light that he accepted bribes when he was governor of Maryland. Nixon in turn nominated Gerald Ford, the minority leader in the House, under the 25th Amendment. Now Ford became president, 1 month after taking office. Ford would pardon Nixon, and because of this, his career would never recover politically. Congress would then also pass the War Powers Act in 1973, therefore taking away a lot of power that the president had under Johnson and Nixon. So you couldn't just basically fight a war unilaterally. You had to constantly report to Congress and give them this report in order for them to supply the troops. But the effects of Watergate was very damaging because here the presidency and the office of the presidency seemed to be eroding. And American people can't seem like we can't even trust our president. We can't trust our elected officials. An unelected president. Ford would veto 39 bills while in office, more than Hoover, who had a full term to do so. Ford rejected pressures to cut taxes and spending, resulting in a plummeting economy and unemployment as high as 9%. He retained Kissinger as his Secretary of State and met with Brezhnev in 1974 to negotiate the Strategic Arm Limitations Treaty 2. Ford battled California Governor Ronald Reagan for the Republican nomination in 1976, eventually securing it. The Democrats would nominate Governor Jimmy Carter of Georgia. Carter promised the American people that I will not lie to the American people. After Vietnam with Johnson and also Watergate with Nixon, this seemed very refreshing to the American people, and Carter would win the presidency with 297 electoral votes to 240 for Ford. Only 2 million votes separated the two candidates. Carter had inherited the negotiation for SALT II, but its adoption was stopped by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. This would lead Carter to pull the United States out of the Olympic Games in 1980 that was going to be held in Moscow. Now, this also upset a number of American people because they said he's not really doing anything about the Soviet aggression. Here they invaded Afghanistan and basically took it over, and we're going to boycott the Olympic Games. And so it looks like Our world power is also eroding as well. The revolution of 1979. The Shah of Iran is going to be toppled and overthrown by young students in Iran, and he's going to be replaced with the Ayatollah Khomeini. They're going to set up a very restrictive religious government, a theocracy, based on the Muslim beliefs. Now, what they wanted was the Shah to be brought back to Iran, to be placed on trial, and basically to be executed. The Shah was also suffering from cancer. And when he asked to be able to enter the United States for cancer treatment, President Carter said yes. As soon as he flew into the United States, Iranian students stormed the American embassy and took over 60 American hostages, demanding the Shah to be extradited in order for the hostages to be released. In response, Carter froze all financial accounts of the Iranians and the United States. Then problems were escalated when the Shah died. Now the Iranians want all that money that the president had frozen. He refused to negotiate with what he saw as basically terrorist type demands. And each day, Americans were reminded of their fellow Americans being held hostage. Day 50, day 100, day 200, and so forth and so forth. Similarities between the Vietnam War and the Iranian hostage crisis destroyed the credibility of all the presidents that were involved, Johnson and Carter. And it seems like here we are at one of the most powerful nations on earth, and we can't do anything to try to rescue our Americans that are held in captivity. Because this was, and by all aspects, an act of war. But with the negativity of Vietnam on the back burner, Carter wasn't willing to pull the trigger. He did order for a rescue attempt, but that failed miserably with the American military dying in the desert in Iran. 1980 is also an election year, and at the same time, inflation would soar. So Americans look like they're losing their faith. They have no trust in their government. They can't fix the economy of the 1970s, the problems of getting into Vietnam, being lied to, Watergate, and now we have Americans being held hostage, and the Soviets seem to be going unchecked all in the world. And so this ends our study of Americans losing faith.